Mamoru Oshii's 1995 Ghost in the Shell is a culmination not only of Oshii's career, but also of hand-drawn cell animation. Yes, the film makes some use of computer-generated imagery, but all the most breathtaking sequences are almost invariably nothing other than hand-drawn animation elevated to a simply staggering level of craft that both rivals and complements similar masterpieces from Studio Ghibli. The cultural impact of Ghost in the Shell has been huge. Manga Entertainment's release of Ghost in the Shell and Akira were cornerstones of the surge of interest in Japanese animation in the West in the 1990s, and it was pivotal in opening up a market for more adult-oriented animation. Ultimately, Ghost in the Shell remains an extremely watchable, achingly beautiful piece of animation that somehow still manages to look more futuristic than pretty much any piece of media that has come out in the near 30 years since its release. But also, we need to talk about the Binman.
Oh, the Binman, I think.
One of the early sequences of the movie sees Section 9 trying to track down a hacker called the Puppet Master, who's been trying to hack the brain of a diplomat's translator using a series of on-street payphones. Remember those? It turns out these hacks are actually being performed by a Binman, a garbage collector A, or B, I'm not 100% certain. Garbage collector A doesn't actually realise what he's doing. He thinks, as he tells his colleague, that he's actually hacking into the brain of his ex-wife to figure out why she left him. And the movie has several scenes of these two talking to each other as he chats casually about how he met a guy in a bar who's taught him how to do this. And I don't think I'm going too much out on a limb to say that that's pretty messed up, right? But what's really jarring when you see Ghost in the Shell on a rewatch today is that nobody really makes a big deal out of what Garbage Collector A is doing. Like, sure, his colleague kind of says a few bits and pieces about how I don't want to be involved in your shady schemes, but it's sort of played as being, like, relatively normal. Like, this guy's talking about, like, selling bootleg VHS tapes or NFTs or something. You know, it's not really the level of response you might typically associate with talking about violating one of the most fundamental aspects of the human condition. When Garbage Collector A actually gets arrested by the cops, they almost immediately realise that he's been ghost hacked. And their response tends to vary between sort of disgust and pity. Like, the lines they use with him are all sort of framed around, "I'm sorry, I don't know how to tell you this, your wife was never real." And none of it is about, "Dude, what the fuck did you think you were doing?" This reflects a level of fucked upness that clearly goes way beyond the Binman. Like, the Puppet Master, when setting out to brain hijack this guy, decided to feed him an alternate reality that's going to persuade him to do the hack on the diplomat's translator. And so he picks hacking this guy's ex-wife as being the thing he's most likely to go along with. And there's actually a scene earlier on in the movie where they mention that the hack that's being done on the diplomat's translator is using an older form of hacking technology. Like, this isn't cutting edge, this stuff is widespread. Okay, this is one example, and I'm not trying to hang an entire thesis off this, but there is other elements in the plot that really kind of paint this picture that Ghost in the Shell is set in a society that's on the brink of some kind of collapse. Let's start with the opening. This scene is a clandestine meeting of sorts, which is kind of mostly there to drop seeds for the plot later on. They're having this clandestine meeting, and the police show up, and some of the guys in the meeting suddenly crack out some machine guns, and everything's starting to get very, very shooty, until one of the people stands up and says, "Okay, everybody, calm down."
Please, can we just calm the fuck down?
It turns out he's a diplomat. And the other person in the meeting, who is a very talented software engineer, has just been granted asylum by this guy. It's at this point that our protagonist, Major Kusanagi, does the famous shot, the naked skydive off the top of a building, but it's cyberpunk tits, so it's okay, and proceeds to kill the diplomat in an almost comically violent way, before breasting boobily off the side of the building and vanishing. If the purpose of this scene was to just set up the protagonist in the plot, then that's one thing, but this goes so much further than that. We learn various things in this immediately. We learn that software engineering is a skill that's so important that it's seen as a strategic asset. So if you try and defect, you're going to draw the attention of the police, both public and secret. It's also a movie where in the first minute or two, we're shown a diplomat being violently killed, having done nothing wrong. The key thing about these elements is that they are textual choices. Somebody actively had to make these decisions. These weren't defaults. If this were the opening of, say, a Bond film, then sure, it might open with James Bond on a previous mission. It would show him killing somebody, but it'd typically be somebody who is an unambiguous villain, like a terrorist or a drug dealer or something. The fact is that we know next to nothing about what's going on in this movie. We don't know anything about the personal circumstances of this software engineer or the country that he's been granted asylum in. The only compass we have as to whether this was a good or a bad thing is simply that it was done by the protagonist. And these scenes in particular come up repeatedly throughout the movie. In fact, the movie's most pivotal scene, where the puppet master's avatar gets switched on inside Section 9, leads to it immediately trying to claim political asylum.
As a sentient life form, I hereby demand political asylum.
This scene has a special place in lots of people's hearts, and not just because of having a 10 out of 10 smoke show with a deep, smooth voice directly addressing the protagonist and alluding to a level of deep intimacy that just sort of does things. But also because this scene encapsulates, in a nutshell, what a lot of people interpret the meaning of the film to be. How do you tell the difference between synthetic life and natural life? But here's the thing. It's irrelevant. If you had to boil down the core essence of what makes cyberpunk distinct from other forms of science fiction, there's a strong argument to be made that it's the fact that in cyberpunk, scientific ideas are not explored in a vacuum. Instead, cyberpunk takes an approach of projecting existing political and social power structures into the future. And as a consequence, the best cyberpunk often winds up commenting on that more than it does on the technology itself. And the scene we were just discussing is a prime example. Nobody's being asked to actually figure out, does this entity have a soul or not? What they're being asked to decide in the moment is, do we hand custody of this thing over to Section 6? And when you look at it like that, like the questions of things like, do I count as a human, become a lot more pressing when there's literally agents of the state ready to black bag me depending upon the answer. And even this level of philosophical question is kind of rendered moot because Section 6 don't actually plan on getting an answer. They just go full extraordinary rendition, steal the Puppet Master's avatar, and blow a hole in the wall on their way out. Your Ghost in the Shell is about what it means to be human? Motherfucker, Ghost in the Shell is about the creeping supremacy of violence over individual rights and systems of law. Is your brain secure because hacking it would be super bad and that you have rights? No, your brain is secure because you have good OPSEC. Or you were sensible and you air-gapped it by never letting Elon Musk put a goddamn Neuralink chip in there in the first place. It's very Nietzschean and kinda nihilistic. But that's still not the point of the story. It's an outlook, I guess, and a setting, I suppose, but it's not really what makes this a story, what makes this worth watching. And for that, I think we need to go to Bato. One of the things that really strikes me looking back on Ghost in the Shell is the dynamic between Kusanagi and Bato. Whereas Kusanagi is kind of highly strung, headstrong and anxious, Bato is this reassuring, grounded presence. He's a ride-or-die friend, found family who has absolutely got your back even when he has no clue what's going on. It feels right that Bato is the person that Kusanagi opens up to, not just about her lingering existential doubts about whether there's even a brain inside her, but also about her growing sense of disquiet about her place in the world. Now look, I promise I'm not just going to try and project a transgender interpretation onto every piece of media.
Speaking in generic terms, the sex of the perpetrator isn't known and remains undetermined.
But I genuinely think there is something about Kusanagi's expression of frustration at being only able to grow and express and be within certain bounds and limitations that really strikes a chord. For me, these feelings feel like they reflect the experience of being an egg. Maybe as much as they reflect the experience of being a woman in 1990s Japan's highly patriarchal society. Kusanagi's eye-opening encounter with a being that describes its physical body as being something that it's been trapped in.
My side, but by acquiring a body, I am now subject to the possibility of dying.
It's a pivotal moment not just in the plot of the movie, but also in the rising emotional tension. Your physical body is not who you are, but it is something that exists in this world, and that there are expectations and claims on it. Kusanagi and Bato joke about how their extremely cybernetically enhanced bodies basically make it impossible for them to quit their jobs. They're owned by their employer, effectively. And the movie's climax sees Kusanagi viscerally tearing her own body apart, trying to get to the puppet master. If Ghost in the Shell has a theme, I would argue that it's about a growing sense of disquiet, of feeling like something isn't right but not knowing how to express it. But it's also more than that. It's a movie about found family and how encountering something or someone that transcends your lived experience can be a really powerful agent of personal change. It's also about how cyber tits are cool